And Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Extremely interesting topics, and appreciate you convening this hearing and your witnesses being here. You've already alluded to it a little bit about the safety and environmental risks of this research being proposed, and we just talked about Russia and some of the other countries and maybe deploying fully things of this nature. And you mentioned a slippery slope, Dr. MacMartin. And what do you mean exactly by slippery slope? Is this something that you mess around with Mother Nature and it may turn into something that's even worse than you're trying to fix?
I was actually referring to the societal process, the concern that if we start doing research, that eventually that's going to lead to deployment, and people might think, wait, we haven't actually decided on deployment yet.
Right.
So that's a concern that people have expressed.
Okay. But is that a concern with any of you folks that are involved in this, that we could unleash something irreversible if you continue to do this cloud brightening or the stratospheric procedure? Is that a possibility?
I think at the level that we're talking about doing things right now, as I think Joe mentioned, the changes to the planet are vanishingly small. It would be hard. It would be hard for you to notice, to even detect it if you didn't know it was happening. So it's really tiny compared to, for example, the impact that flying an aircraft from Washington, D.C. to Seattle would have on the planet. So they're small today. If one wants to get to the point of considering having a climate-altering effect, then the impacts get much more important to worry about, and we have to be more careful and when things get ramped up to that time.
Right.
As Kelly mentioned, I think it would take 20 years to decide on whether we have a good enough understanding to decide that it might be useful to do this or not, if we're going all out on it, I think.
Right, thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would just reiterate that a lot of the sort of smaller scale field experiments that scientists are presently proposing to do are going to be unnoticeable to the untrained eye. You need a really fancy experimental setup and cool instruments to even detect that it's going on, right? Questions of, does this research affect sort of other societal questions about how we address climate change are real, but I think it's a bit of speculation to say whether that'll cut one way or another. We should go about this judiciously and carefully and slowly and with an open and transparent process. I think that's probably the best approach.
Okay.
I agree.
Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the things that may be helpful from a governance process or an oversight process is a definition of what we mean by research scale or small scale experiments, and then lots of transparency with regard to that, so that where it's not easy for people to understand what the limits of these things are, we have some very bright, shiny lines between what we do for research and the kinds of things that would have greater impacts.
Okay, and while you're at the mic, you discussed the need for a research framework earlier in this field, and could you explain what your whole systems approach to geoengineering research would be?
Well, probably not terribly briefly, but I think it's what's sometimes referred to as a transdisciplinary field. So we think about certainly the climate research part of it. We have a technology innovation component. We need to think how systems would interact together and how different actions taken on the Earth system would interact, like policies that we make that change the forcings in the climate too. So part of a research program is to bring people who are not currently present into the discussion, starting with aerosol engineers and other types of engineers who would be needed to think about how these things would actually work. Looking at the innovations in observations, measurement, and computing. So today, the experiment that I showed you about marine cloud brightening, they do observations like that now of pollutants. And when they go out and take those measurements, they bring them back. They take months to analyze the data. If we're acting on the Earth system actively, we're going to want information much faster, and we're going to need to improve our systems to do that. So when we think about the whole system, we have to think forward a little bit about what we'd be looking at in terms of the feedback to the perturbations that we make and how we need to understand them. Does that help?
Yes. Yes, it does. Thank you very much, and my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes